Today on the Playbook Podcast, new jobs numbers this morning are expected to show a weakening labor market. How will the Trump administration respond? The Defense Department gets a Trumpy rebranding, and the DOJ makes a dramatic escalation in what critics call lawfare. Hello, I'm Zack Stanton.
And I'm Megan Messerly. It's Friday, September 5th.
And this is the Playbook Podcast. Good morning, Megan. How are you doing?
Good morning, Zack. I'm fantastic. Happy to be here with you.
I'm glad to have you. It's been a long week, and I'm glad to have you as company here as we bring it to a close.
100%. Well, we're going to chat through it and finish the week out strong.
Exactly. So let's get right to what's driving the day. The big thing that folks in Washington will be watching today is the August jobs report, which drops at 8:30 this morning. And the expectation is that the numbers could offer something of a warning sign that the private sector jobs boom that Donald Trump pledged to deliver in his second term is starting to look maybe a little shaky. If there are mounting signs of deterioration in the jobs market, as Politico's Sam Sutton wrote into Playbook this morning, he noted that the processing firm ADP's closely watched update on private sector employment reported tepid growth in August, that the outplacement firm Challenger Gray and Christmas reported on Thursday that employers have announced more layoffs so far in 2025 than in any year since COVID-19 briefly shut down the global economy, and that for the first time since 2021, there are now more unemployed Americans than there are available jobs. And Megan, that adds up to a potentially politically precarious situation for the White House. A weak report, or substantial revisions to previously reported jobs gains, could blow a hole in Trump's claims that he's unleashed a new golden age for American workers. What is your sense of how the White House aims to message around this if the numbers come in as weak as some experts are expecting?
Well, it's a great question because I don't think most folks thought that these BLS jobs numbers would become a political flashpoint, and yet here we are. I think about this a couple of different ways. On one hand, obviously, as you mentioned, President Trump wants strong numbers. He wants to show that the economy is thriving under him, all of those things. At the same time, weak jobs numbers means more likelihood that the Fed gives him the interest rate cut that he's been pushing for months. And so there is sort of a catch-22 here of do you or don't you want a strong jobs report? I think it's worth noting the president also gave a little preview last night of some of the messaging that we might see in this. He was asked about the job numbers coming out today and how he'd respond. And he said the real numbers will be out a year from now. And of course, what he's referring to there is he has all these agreements that he's made with companies to reshore operations, to open new manufacturing facilities, whether TSMC in Arizona, Apple. And so he's saying that for now, you're only going to see these construction jobs and making these facilities, but the real numbers are going to be when these facilities are up and running, and we've created all these big, beautiful American jobs. So I think that's a little taste of what we might see out of the White House today, depending on how those numbers come out. But in some ways, they can't lose here because at the very minimum, they could be getting the interest rate cut they want, or they have great jobs numbers they can tout.
Absolutely. And that's sort of the silver lining, I guess, for the White House if these numbers turn out to be rather cloudy. The other thing that I'm really going to be watching is how the firing of BLS chief Erica McIntyre after July's weak jobs numbers and the downward revisions of previous months, how that will figure into the way the White House responds here. If the numbers are tepid, will they dismiss them and say they aren't to be trusted, that there was still partisan spin being put on them? Or alternatively, if the numbers maybe come in a little better than expected, there's still the question if those numbers can be trusted by the broader public. So I'm curious how you see that playing out. We saw Trump get asked about this a bit yesterday and whether the numbers can be trusted. He said we'll have to wait and see what the numbers say.
Yeah, I think that in of itself is indicative of this challenging situation we're in. And this sort of speaks to, why the BLS has been independent so that folks can trust these facts and figures, regardless if they're the numbers the president wants or the public wants or what have you. So precisely this question speaks to the challenge here of not knowing whether we can or can't trust these numbers. I think to your point, probably the more frustrated the White House is with the numbers, the more sense that maybe they're reliable, because if they're being manipulated, you'd think that they would go in the White House's favor, right? So
Right.
that's one data point. But to your point, if they're not the numbers the White House wanted, you can certainly see the president continuing to raise these concerns about the BLS and what have you. I think it's also worth pointing out in this broader discussion about this data have been legitimate questions about the efforts to modernize BLS data systems and actually make the data quality better. And so, even if these numbers come out, there's still broader questions about, are there real efforts that need to be done just to make this data higher quality, not from a partisan perspective, but just from
Right.
a lot of the government systems are really old perspective.
And speaking of government modernization, or at least changes, that brings us to the second topic that's going to stir conversation today, which is that President Trump is expected to sign an executive order that would change the name of the Department of Defense to the Department of War. And officially changing that name would likely require a vote of Congress. But as our colleagues on Politico's defense team, still known as the defense team, not the war team yet, I guess, report, the White House is looking for ways to avoid an act of Congress, perhaps by using Department of War as sort of a secondary title for the DoD. What is it here that the administration is trying to accomplish with this rebrand? What is the message that they are aiming to send?
I think the big one here is that the president has made very clear that he wants to telegraph a position of military strength and might. And to him, the idea that this is a Department of Defense just isn't quite bold enough. And it doesn't point to the fact that the US could use its military power to go on offense abroad, that there might be reasons it might want to do that. And so I think to him, this idea that it's the Department of Defense sort of closes the door, whereas he sees the Department of War as opening it. It's also worth noting that this department used to be called the Department of War, dating
Mhm.
back to the earliest days of the country, and has gone through name changes, combining different departments and what have you. And it's only been since the post World War II period that it's been known as the Department of Defense. And so I think really what we've seen is this effort to sort of take the country back to the World War I, World War II era. The president talks about this, right? Like, we were winning wars back then, so we should go back to the name we were using back then. It's a point that Defense Secretary, I guess soon to be Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, has made as well when talking about this. And so I think it really just comes down to the way that the president really uses rhetoric and language to sort of frame the country and its position in the world in such a way that it telegraphs strength and that it's sending the message that he wants it to. He thinks sort of a lot about the optics of these things. And I see a lot of that in this decision.
Yes, I mean, he's an optics obsessed guy, and Hegseth is too to some degree as well, down to the American flag lining in his suit coats
Yeah.
to talking about restoring the warrior ethos across the
Yep.
Pentagon and throughout the armed forces. And this really seems of a piece with that. And so it's one of those things that is going to be interesting to watch and to see how it plays out. And, as our colleagues note, one interesting little wrinkle in this is that though the Trump administration has tried to kind of shrink aspects of the Pentagon's budget, a rebrand of the DoD is going to require billions of dollars to change signage and things of that sort, which is, I guess, the smallest impact in some ways, but adds up.
It really does. And one of the things that jumps out to me as well is, and other folks have noted this too, but the president is on this campaign right now for the Nobel Peace Prize for mediating peace between all of these different countries. And yet he's renaming his Department of Defense the Department of War. So there's a certain irony there that some folks have pointed out.
Yeah, we'll see how the folks in Norway react to that.
Yes.
So the third thing I wanted to get to is about mortgages, which sounds very dry as a topic, but it's actually about something much deeper. Yesterday, the Wall Street Journal reported that the DOJ has opened a criminal investigation into Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook and has issued subpoenas as part of an inquiry into whether she submitted fraudulent information on her mortgage applications. Now, the context for this is that the Trump administration has tried to fire her from the Fed as part of its effort to exert more influence over the Fed, and also as Federal Housing Finance Agency Chief Bill Pulte has made something of a trend of selectively investigating the mortgage applications of the president's political enemies over homes that they've listed as their primary residences. So, Megan, opening a criminal investigation here still feels like it's a dramatic escalation and potentially maybe a cross the Rubicon moment amid accusations of weaponizing the DOJ.
It really is. And I think a lot of folks are seeing it as such. Obviously, part of this goes back to the broader thing we were talking about earlier, which is the president's frustrations about the Fed and his desire for it to lower interest rates. He's obviously been talking about Fed Chair Jay Powell for a long time. But instead of targeting him and trying to remove him, he's taken this extraordinary step of removing Lisa Cook. And this is an investigation of mortgage fraud over allegations that Cook listed multiple homes as her primary residence. But the challenge here is that is something that is very common. Obviously, you're not supposed to do it, it's against the law, but it is extremely common. One report has it at like a third of mortgage applications see this kind of phenomenon. And so, this is the challenge you have there when you have Bill Pulte as a political actor selectively enforcing something that is so common. It's very easy to see how the administration would be able to catch up almost anyone they want, or a lot of people at least, in these kinds of allegations and prosecute them using this method. I think on the other hand, there's this ongoing lawsuit from Lisa Cook over her firing. We're waiting to see how that plays out. Some sort of investigation here might further bolster the president's case for dismissing her. Of course, the argument that he's made is that even just the specter of wrongdoing was enough to fire her. And this comes down to the idea of what counts as cause when you're fired for cause is just these allegations and the fact they exist enough to fire her. So obviously a criminal investigation or the conclusion of some kind of investigation would give the president more backing to oust her. But ultimately, this all comes down to the president wanting to gain control over the Fed to be able to get the decision he wants out of it. I mean, we have to see how all of this resolves, but it very easily could give the president a majority on the Fed, this independent body, to make the kind of decisions that he wants them to make.
And to your point about this being fairly common, what Bill Pulte has done here is really opened the administration up to accusations that there is similar wrongdoing in the mortgage applications of its officials. And
Mhm.
yesterday we saw ProPublica issue a report on exactly that. They wrote that at least three of Trump's cabinet secretaries have multiple houses listed as their primary residences on mortgages. And it really makes me wonder here if we're doing a criminal investigation, is there going to be a shoe on the other foot here if Democrats retake the White House in 2028?
The challenge with some of these kinds of political maneuvers is once one side uses them, the other side can equally use them as well. And there will be some kind of legal precedent by the time a new administration rolls around. I think the one argument against that would be that Democrats have not shown the
Right.
willingness or the desire to sort of use the levers of the executive branch in as creative a way, or some would say pushing the boundaries or exceeding the boundaries of the law kind of way. It's unclear whether Democrats would do that, but I think we're certainly seeing frustrations from the Democratic base wanting their leaders to be a little bit more of a renegade and insurgent in their tactics, sort of fighting fire with fire, because some in the party think that playing by the rules hasn't worked for them. So I think jury's out on how a future Democratic presidency might approach this kind of thing.
Well, as always, we like to end the show with something from the Playbook newsletter. And on this coming Sunday, as week one of the NFL season goes into full bloom, President Donald Trump will be taking in a tennis match. The White House confirmed last night that the president will attend the men's final of the US Open. And Megan, this kind of surprised me. We've seen the president attend a number of sporting events, but they all tend to be along the lines of really super macho sporting events, UFC matches, college football games. Tennis, nothing against tennis at all. I love it, but it's definitely not that. I'm curious what the impetus for this is.
Yeah, it's certainly not one that might first come to mind when you think of the president, but it's actually worth noting that the president used to attend the US Open all the time before he became president. He last attended in 2015 and was booed, and that's the last time he's been. But he actually was surprisingly a tennis guy. And I think the president has shown himself to be fairly equal opportunity when it comes to sports, whether it's having the Dodgers in the Oval Office, football teams. He went to the Super Bowl. He's been to NASCAR, UFC, obviously the World Cup in 2026. And and the Olympics. And I think him going to the US Open just shows that he's embraced the sports as they come, whatever sport that may be.
Well, it'll certainly be something to watch. You can send us your tips, your birthdays, your spotted moments to playbook@politico.com. Megan, thanks so much for being here.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure as always. And that's all for today's show. But we have much more news and analysis in today's Playbook newsletter, which you can find at politico.com/playbook. We'll be back on Monday. Have a great weekend.